That's all right. If at any point you can't understand what I'm saying, just to say so. I'm happy to repeat myself. But also I think Professor Dominguez is also very happy to offer a translation, if that also proves easier. But yes, thank you so much for having me with you today. It's a great pleasure to be here. And to say where I'm coming from, but also to give you a sense of the place that I'll be talking about. We have this tiny, lonely island, ever lonelier island, called the United Kingdom. And in the northwest corner of England, we have this region, which is in the county of Cumbria, but it's a region that is famous for a mountainous upland landscape and glacial lakes. It's famous from the 18th century as a tourist destination, a place where people travel, and also as a place strongly associated with the fine arts tradition in painting, topographical sketching, and equally in literature, preeminently on account of the poetry of a poet named William Wordsworth, whom we'll talk about a little bit, but also later cultural figures including the art critic and social writer John Ruskin. And I asked you to have a little look at a few pieces of Wordsworth's writing about the railway and its relationship to this region, and then a later preface that Ruskin wrote as part of a second series of protests, which we'll contextualize in a few moments, about the railway. We'll come to that. We'll come to that. But I wanted to start really, if you keep these places in mind, it's a bit blurry, but some key places are Kendal, right here, Ambleside, Windermere, this region, and Grasmere. And then later on I might mention that Ruskin, John Ruskin, lived in Coniston. He lived in a place called Branton, which is right here. This is the lake of Coniston, this is the lake of Windermere. Just maybe keep that geography in mind as we proceed. But I'll show you a different version of Windermere, which is this painting. And I'm afraid you can't see it very clearly. So what I'll do, if you bear with me for a moment, is I'll make it just a little lighter. That's a bit better. Okay? Maybe a little better. Bear with me. So here we have James Baker Pine's Windermere, seen from Orr's Head. It was a painting composed in 1849, but first displayed in 1851, 155 years ago, in London as part of the Great Exhibition of 1851. And it's part of a series of 25 paintings that were paintings of this region, the Lake District. Massive paintings, about 2.5, I'm always bad with meters, but it's about this size, about 2.5 feet. Sorry, I think in English measurements, 2.5 feet by 4 feet. So a very large painting, almost this size, depicting the lake of Windermere, looking from the north southwards to a settlement at the foot of the lake called Newby Bridge. And in the distance we have, if you can't see, if you look there at the top corner, a thunderstorm coming in over the top of the mountain. It's a famous view, this view of Windermere, the lake seen from Orr's Head. It's a view that many writers wrote about in the period, in the middle of the 19th century. It's a view that's also celebrated by William Wordsworth, that poet whom I was mentioning, both in a guidebook he wrote about this region, but also in an important sonnet, which you've encountered, and which we'll turn momentarily. It's this view from Orr's Head. It's a view you find in some earlier paintings of the region. Here we have another landscape, much earlier landscape, this one from 1766, painted by an artist named Mary Lowther. And you'll see some key differences between the two. They're the same view, but some very different characteristics between the two. I mean, in the first sense, you can see that Lowther has much more attention being paid to topographical particularity. So you get a firmer sense of the contours of the landscape. Whereas Pine's later painting works much more with light, with atmosphere, with a sense of mood, if you will. Just to show them again slightly larger. So this is the earlier painting from 1766 by London. This is Pine's painting from 1849. I think it's illuminating to study these paintings alongside one another, the one illuminating characteristics of the other, because they have differences. They have some similarities as well. I mean, in both cases, we have a very similar view. We have a sense of a shaded foreground. We have, I hope you can see, figures in the foreground. This couple who are standing beneath this slightly scrawny tree in Lowther's painting. And we have these figures seated in the foreground and standing in the foreground in Pine. So shaded foregrounds, the use of figures, these are characteristics of the tradition of the picturesque aesthetic in art and artistic representation, which was characteristic of the kinds of landscape paintings that you find of the region, the Lake District, from the 18th and 19th centuries. There's one thing, though, and you won't be able to see it here, I'm afraid, because it's quite dark. There's one thing that Pine's painting has that Lowther's couldn't possibly have had. In order to make this clear, I think I need to make this image much brighter. Let's go here. It will discolor it, unfortunately, I'm afraid. You can see here in the corner, we have the railway. We have a train, and I'd be happy maybe to post these slides, send them to Professor Dominguez, who might be able to share them with you if you wanted to look more closely. But we have here a down train returning from Windermere to Kendal. And if we look beyond the figures in the lower foreground, we have a station, Windermere Station, the railway station, and another train, railway train, waiting to depart. What's very intriguing then, and what makes a significant difference between these two paintings, is that the Pine painting from 1849 shows us not one, but two Windermeres. Both this lake, the famous lake, but also the town. And that's what's really intriguing about this image. Because before the coming of the railway, in 1847, to the settlement that was then known as Birthwaite, sort of sleepy little town in the hills, the town of Windermere didn't exist. When the railway came to Birthwaite in 1847, the town was renamed Windermere. And the entire landscape was effectively rewritten by the presence and the arrival of the railway. This returns me to that Wordsworth sonnet I was mentioning a few moments ago, which I hope you recognize as the preamble to these letters that were later published, that Wordsworth wrote in the 1840s to the editor of the Morning Post, which was a national newspaper, chiefly a London newspaper. Do you have a copy of this in front of you? It's all right, so that you can read online, but you can also read here. This is just the first 10 lines, but I'll read you the sonnet in its entirety, and I'll try to read slowly. This is Wordsworth writing, in outrage, about the projection of this railway in the mid-1840s. Is then no nook of English ground secure from rash assault? Schemes of retirement sown in youth, and mid the busy world kept pure, as when their earliest flowers of hope were blown, must perish. How can they endure this? How can they this blight endure? And must he too, the ruthless change bemoan, who scorns a false utilitarian lore, mid his paternal fields at random thrown? Baffled the threat, bright scene, from orist head given to the pausing traveller's rapturous glance. Plead for thy peace, thou beautiful romance of nature, and if human hearts be dead, speak, passing winds. Ye torrents, with your strong and constant voice, protest against the wrong. But I call attention here specifically to the invocation of Orist Head, the hill by the lake, as invoked as a guardian, as a protector of the landscape that surrounds it. I was particularly taken by the use of the word baffle in this context, which I suppose today in English tends to be used more to describe a confounding. I don't know what the best translation would be. Professor Dominguez, would baffle, would you say? Baffle the threat. Confused?
Yes, confundidos por la amenaza.
Yeah. So baffle is very funny. I mean, if you look at the word baffle, historically, it has very uncertain origins, but in this case it doesn't only mean confused, but it means effectively withstand. So it's a word that's being used very particularly, I think, in this context. The hillside itself should baffle the threat of the railway and its approach, to baffle the threat bright seen from Orist Head, given to the pausing traveller's rapturous glance. Now, Wordsworth's efforts included this sonnet, which he wrote in 1844, which was published in the national newspaper, and then was followed by these two letters, which I hope you've had a chance to look at, which were also published in the Morning Post. And today I think it might strike us as a peculiar, maybe not an unprecedented or a common thing, but still a peculiar thing that a poet should weigh in on what is effectively, I guess in part, a political decision, but ultimately an economic decision. That poetry has a right to speak to powers whose legislate, and that a poet can assume the platform of as a participant in regional and national political and economic planning. Wordsworth in this context is following the example, and I think very much so taking up the mantle of the English poet John Milton, who is also a famous writer of political sonnets, who is equally famous as the unofficial laureate of the English Commonwealth in the 17th century. This is the political movement that led to the temporary suspension of the English monarchy in the middle of the 17th century under the protectorship of Oliver Cromwell, the English general. Milton, alongside Cromwell, was a prominent figure in this political movement in the mid-17th century, and as much as he wrote speeches in support and tracts in support of Cromwell's right to rule, he also, through his pen as a poet, enfranchised Cromwell's right to rule. So Wordsworth is following very much in that lineage, but here writing not about the governance of the realm, but about the security of this one region as being a place into which the railway, into which industrializing modernity shouldn't enter. He speaks in these letters of the region as a place to be protected, as a place whose tranquility and whose distance from industrial development is a presiding characteristic, gives it its meaning, and that for the railway to enter into the region would ultimately be to take away all of those things that characterize it as unique and special. Wordsworth was famously unsuccessful. The railway in 1847, as we've already seen, extended from Kendal to Windermere, and the landscape of the region was forever changed. You can still today, 170 years later, take the train north from Lancaster, the university which I work, to Kendal, and then you take another train, a small branch line, to Windermere, and you can go to the same station. It's still in operation. It's a place where tourists go all year long, but especially in the summertime. Many of whom are attracted to the region by Wordsworth's poetry, but possibly today, even more so by the writing of Beatrix Potter, the authoress of the Peter Rabbit Tales. You know the Peter Rabbit Tales? Yeah.
Beatrice
I see a few.
Beatrice Potter, yeah.
Anyhow, a few nods around the room, but I think many tourists today, as much as they might be interested in Wordsworth's influence, are particularly interested in Beatrix Potter's influence in describing this region. In any case, Wordsworth is unsuccessful despite the impassioned protest that he put forward in these letters published in the Morning Post. Now, one issue that Wordsworth was particularly concerned about in that context was that the extension of the railway from Kendal to Windermere was, to speak idiomatically, the thin end of the wedge, or the first step in a larger series of railway developments. That the railway might extend then to Windermere, but then what next? Would it extend from Windermere through the very heart of the Lakeland region? This, as he raises in his letters, is one of the chief causes for concern. This itself is just the first in a projected series of outrages. And 30 years later, just such a further outrage, to use that word, was proposed. In the early 1870s, a different railway company projected the idea of extending the line from Windermere northwards towards the town of Keswick in the north of the region, but cutting through the very heart of the Lake District. A man from Kendal, who is a shoemaker, named Robert Somerville, tried to bring together a group of local people, but also significant national figures, to express concern about this proposal. And he very prominently elicited the support of John Ruskin, an art critic. Now, John Ruskin was born nearly 50 years after Wordsworth, in 1819, and at this point was an old man. At this point he was approaching 60 years of age and had largely retired to Coniston, that other lake which I pointed on the map a few minutes ago. And Ruskin was initially reluctant, but then very supportive of the cause to which Somerville was eliciting his aid. And Somerville, when he published a pamphlet, the protest against the extension of railways in the Lake District, very prominently displayed Ruskin's support. Now, the other reading that I ask you to have a look at for this week is the preface that Ruskin wrote for this pamphlet. It's an illuminating document, I think, to read alongside Wordsworth's letters to the Morning Post, because I think we find Ruskin and Wordsworth making very similar rhetorical moves. Very similar rhetorical moves. One should add that Ruskin, like Wordsworth, was also parodied in his attempts. I don't know if you've ever seen before, there's a wonderful English magazine from the 19th century called Punch, which included poetry and essays and political commentary, but also cartoons. And here we have a cartoon by a man named Lindsay Sanborn, published here in 1876, parodying John Ruskin, who is an art critic, and here depicted as a knight with the body of a tube of paint, and an artist's palette, and a paint knife, doing battle against the railway in defense of the lady of the lake. So Ruskin was also parodied in the popular press for his support of Somerville's railway protest. I just wanted to include that. I think it's a delightful cartoon. But in any case, the intriguing comparisons that can be drawn between Wordsworth's letters from the Morning Post and Ruskin's preface to Somerville's pamphlet. There are interesting connections that can be drawn biographically between these two figures. I mentioned that Ruskin was almost 60 years old by the time that he wrote the preface for Somerville's pamphlet. Wordsworth himself, in 1844, when he wrote the sonnet, which you've now heard, and wrote those letters to the Morning Post, was 74 years old, approaching the end of his life. So they're both at the end of their careers. They're both famous individuals for sake of their contributions to English literature, in Ruskin's case also to art and art criticism. So they use their cultural celebrity to leverage space to speak on these issues nationally. One characteristic difference, I think, though, which is interesting to take some consideration of, and I'd be interested, I don't want to put any of you individually on the spot, but I'd be interested to know what you think, is that Ruskin's petition, as part of the Somerville protest, was successful, whereas Wordsworth's letters to the Morning Post were ultimately unsuccessful in protesting for the prevention of the extension of railways. The Windermere Railway opened in 1847. The projected extension of that railway in the 1870s was unsuccessful. It was unsuccessful for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons was the success of the protest that Robert Somerville mounted with John Ruskin's support and with John Ruskin's contributions. So I open it up to you. I think we have a little time for a conversation about this. I open up to you. I'd be curious to know, why do you think, on the basis of having read the letters that Wordsworth wrote, having read the preface that Ruskin wrote, why do you think that the one was successful and the other was unsuccessful? Is there anything in Ruskin's letters, Ruskin's preface, if you avoid confusion, anything in Ruskin's preface that seemed more compelling as an argument than the argument put forth in Wordsworth's letters? And don't worry, take a moment if you want to think about it. I won't put anyone on the spot. Professor DeLing anyway. But if anyone wants to volunteer an idea or a thought, I'd be very welcome to hear. Do you think there's anything that Ruskin writes that is more compelling as an argument than what Wordsworth writes?
En definitiva, si tivemos a oportunidade de facer as dúas lecturas, por que o prefacio de Ruskin tivo éxito fronte ás cartas de Wordsworth en contra do ferrocarril? Vedes no propio texto, nas súas estrategias retóricas, algún elemento distinto que poda explicar por que un tivo éxito e outro non?
Maybe it's the structure.
The structure?
Yeah.
Yes, excellent. Should we raise the lights a little bit? Is that all right?
Yes, sure.
I can bring the pictures back up if you want, but maybe then I can see you more clearly, and you can see me more clearly. So the structure of the preface.
I think it's more compelling because of the numbering. So he's listing a series of points, but then at the end he romanticizes nature again. He says, the beauty of nature is the blessedness and most necessary blessings for man. So at the same time he's kind of appealing to that desire of the population to preserve the Lake District of the
Yes, I'm very sorry. I couldn't quite hear you. Can you just say the end again? So when what was the passage you draw attention to?
Well, I was referring to the list of points that he makes.
Yes, I see. Oh, I see in the middle. So the five, he enumerates them, doesn't he? Those 5 key points. Okay.
And then I mentioned how he romanticizes nature.
Mm.
He said, almost at the very end, the beauty of nature is the blessedness and most necessary blessings for man. And I think that appeals to the desire of the population to preserve the Lake District, I suppose.
Mm. Yes, I mean, it seems actually a very intriguing common point between the two, that both of them present the concept of nature and the presence of nature as something that has a benevolent effect upon human beings. That there's something that people gain from being in in environments that aren't strictly cultivated by human habitation, by human dwelling. But Ruskin, I think, the point you make about structure, I think, is actually a really helpful one. He delineates his argument succinctly in these 5 key points, where he raises ideas. And it's interesting to see the ideas he raises. He raises ideas either to affirm them or to rebuke them. Wordsworth makes some very similar claims about these issues, but Ruskin provides them in a succinct and compact form. So he raises the issue of the commercial potential of this investment in the region in terms of facilitating increased mining, increased access to resources, and says that this is a fallacy. Secondly, that the scenery must be made more accessible. We find Wordsworth saying very similar things. The scenery, the railway company claims that the scenery must be made more accessible, but that the railways already come in close enough proximity to the region to make it accessible. And that, as Ruskin tells us, actually to take people directly to these locations themselves is to bypass much of what is to be enjoyed about traveling to the region. Because there's something about the pace of travel that's significant. So to travel by coach and carriage road, as opposed to traveling by railway at a greater velocity, provides a different sort of access and experience to the landscape itself. The broader context of all this, I think, is important to take into consideration, because the people that Ruskin and Wordsworth are talking about are largely the developing working class in centres, in the north of England very specifically, but throughout the country. So across the 19th century, due to the increased industrialisation of areas like Manchester, Bradford, Leeds, these cities that are distinguished today by virtue of an industrial heritage. This led to an increasing population, and it also led to the owners of mills and factories desiring to provide their workers with access to locations like the Lake District, also in the case is access to coastal resorts like Scarborough on the east coast or Blackpool on the west coast, for their workers to have respite, to have vacation. And it's those individuals who are most brought to the fore in Wordsworth and Ruskin's writing. So we have this issue of structure, and that might be something that is characteristic of both works, but is particularly characteristic of the way that Ruskin summarizes some key points. Is there anything else that Ruskin does that stands out to you as different from what Wordsworth does in his pamphlet? There may not be. I think they're very similar documents. If it's easy to put it this way, is there anything that you thought was surprisingly similar about what these two writers are doing in advocating against the extension of the railway into the region? Don't worry. Well, one thing that I thought was actually particularly interesting, that we might sort of pin down a little bit, is the way that each of them use illustrations, whether by way of anecdote or by way of how to put this, a kind of thought experiment, a scenario. Now in Wordsworth's case, he uses the example of the poet Robert Burns, a Scottish poet from the 18th century, the generation prior to Wordsworth, who's a significant figure in terms of the culture of the border regions in Scotland, but also a significant celebrant of the locality in which he lived in the southwest of Scotland. And Wordsworth tells us that Burns' sensitivity to nature wasn't something that was applicable in all places. Burns felt a strong tie to his birthplace. In the songs he wrote about his birthplace, its streams, its hills, are more powerful, more reflective of a deep inner feeling than the writing that he composed about other parts of Scotland. Wordsworth illustrates this point to tell us that there's nothing inherent about a taste for scenery, but a taste for beautiful, a taste for the beautiful in nature. That it's something that is a culture, something that one learns through experience and through education. Ruskin makes a very similar claim by way of a different scenario, a different sort of anecdote in the introduction to his preface. He raises the issue of imagining himself in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where he studied as a young man and where for years, across the mid-19th century, he held a professorship. I don't know if you have this in front of you, but it's on page 138. Let's take a moment to think through this. I'll read aloud. Suppose I were sitting, bottom of the page, suppose I were sitting where still, in much changed Oxford, I am happy to find myself, in one of the little latticed cells of the Bodleian Library, and my kind and much loved friend, Mr. Cox, the librarian, were to come to me with news that it was proposed to send 900 excursionists to the library every day in parties of 3. It's a bit humorous to begin to think about. You could think of the university library, that all the tourists who go into the centre of the old city to see the cathedral are also brought to the library and they're paraded through in parties of 300. And that it should be intended, Ruskin continues, that these people should elevate their minds by reading all the books they can lay hold on, that they can read, while they stayed. So they spend a day in the library in a party of 300 reading whatever they can read. And that practically scientific persons accompanying them might look out for and burn manuscripts that have any gold or illuminations in them, so any kind of tracery in gilt, any decorations that contain precious metals. These might be taken and melted down for their base constituents because they have practicable service. This is a slightly perverse scenario, but it's a scenario that he then uses analogously to describe what people are proposing and advocating for the further extension of the railways into the region. That you can learn something about nature, Ruskin's argument is, by spending only a day brought from your factory city into the hills of Cumbria, into the hills of the Lake District. Ruskin's argument is much like Wordsworth along these lines, that it's something that needs to be nurtured in the individual, educated in the individual. And that the minerals that might lay within the within the mountains and hills of this region, in this case, much less the case that it's not gold, but usually copper, iron, other kinds of base metals, that these are more precious as part of the landscape itself than they would become if extracted and used for industrial ends. That the gold in the illumination in a manuscript has a kind of value that it can't have, taken out of that context and put to other uses. Equally, the minerals that lay and that are key constituents within the mountains and hills of the region are themselves valuable in a way that they cannot be valuable if taken out of that context. He writes, "True, we know well enough," this is on page 139, "we know well enough what the 900 excursionist scholars, these people brought to the library, we know what they don't. That the library can't be quite read through in a quarter of an hour. You can't really gain much from a library just by entering into it for a short period of time and glancing at whatever you can see. And that there are pleasures in real reading, in the slow reading of text that takes time. There are pleasures in real reading that are quite different from merely turning pages, merely scanning books. That also there's a value in gold in a missal, in an altar book, or slate in a crag, in a quarry. That is a value more precious than can be found if that gold were to be put in a bank or that slate were to be put in a chimney. These arguments that are similar to the arguments that Wordsworth is making, Ruskin puts them, I think, in a slightly more compelling form by virtue of these kinds of anecdotal situations. But it's interesting, I think, ultimately, to think how closely the arguments being made by each of these men is. A key difference, I think, and this speaks to the point you raised about structure, is the way in which they relate their arguments to themselves. If you read through Wordsworth's letters, one thing you'll often find is that Wordsworth is drawing upon his own feelings, his own opinions about the railway itself. He refers to a broader community who share these opinions and these feelings, but he presents himself as being personally outraged, personally affronted. Ruskin, I think, is very careful, especially at the outset of his letter, to present his position as one that isn't strictly personal. That is an advocation against the railway, that is voiced for the greater good, not for himself, but for others. I think this is a key rhetorical difference between the two. Wordsworth, although he elicits a broader community of opinion, speaks foremostly for himself and on the basis of his own thoughts, his own feelings. Ruskin, although he speaks very much for himself, is also speaking with a different kind of ethos, with a different kind of object as well. Ruskin, in his early life, like Wordsworth, with even more pressure from his parents, I think, than Wordsworth had, Ruskin was expected to become a bishop. His parents sent him to university. I think his father had aspirations that, well, maybe he might become an author as well. But his mother certainly, a very strong kind of Protestant tradition of Calvinism in Ruskin's early family. Ruskin's mother aspired that he would become a bishop. And although he disappointed his mother by not becoming a bishop and not entering into the church, there is something of an ecclesiastical spirit, a spirit of sermonizing, that enters into Ruskin's writing. And this comes through very strongly at the very conclusion. There's something about this work in particular, even more so than Wordsworth's letters, that assumes the quality of a spoken address, the quality of sermonizing, at the very end. So he's addressing here individuals who would speak in support of this proposed extension to the railway. We'll start from the top of page 143. If then, my benevolent friend, you are prepared to take out your 2 pence, your 2 pennies, and to give them to the host here in Cumberland, in the Lake District, saying, take care of him, take care of this traveller, and whatsoever thou spendest more, I will repay thee when I come to Cumberland. This is interestingly biblical, interestingly, even in Ruskin's time, antiquated language, thee and thou, instead of the simple English you. I will repay thee 3 times the amount when I come to Cumberland myself. On these terms, O my benevolent friends, I am with you, hand in glove, in every effort you wish to make from the enlightenment of poor men's eyes. So, if your work is motivated by the desire to do good to the greater community of man, then I can support such an effort. But if your motive, on the contrary, is to put 2 pence into your own pocket through the extension of this railway, not to bestow goods upon other people, but to take through commercial gain, if you are to put these 2 pence in your own purse, stolen between the Jerusalem and Jericho, again another strongly biblical allusion, of Keswick and Ambleside, these 2 towns in this region, by extending a railway between them. And if you were to take this money out of the poor traveller's pocket and charging him for a railway ticket to these places, if your motivation, in other words, in building this railway is simply your own commercial gain, and if that is your real object in your charitable offering, is not even to lend unto the Lord by giving to the poor, but to lend unto the Lord by making dividends out of the poor, then, my pious friends, enthusiastic Ananias, pitiful Judas, and sanctified Cora, I will do my best in God's name to stay your hands and stop your tongues. There's a kind of oratorical flourish to that conclusion, which possesses a quality of language not unlike the language one might expect to find in a sermon. This, I think, is a tonal difference between the two works, the stylistic difference between the two works. But I think it does speak to something about Ruskin's writing that contributed to the success of Somerville's protest as performed by means of the pamphlet to which Ruskin contributed. More generally, I think we're going to come to maybe a bit of a pause here between the first and second halves of the session. More generally, though, I think I'd be interested to know from you a little bit more about how this compares with some of the other writers that you've been studying on this module over the last 13 weeks. Here we have examples of two writers who, at the end of their careers, chose to use their cultural celebrity to assume a platform in protest against the further extension of railways into the region. They voiced their concerns in terms of economic implications, but chiefly in terms of cultural and social implications that the extension of the railway has, the way that it doesn't provide the kind of beneficial service that the advocates of the railway claim to be providing, the way that it has a deleterious effect on local communities who the railway advocates claim will be benefited by the extension of these railways. This is an intriguing kind of work, an intriguing kind of political, social, economic work for a poet to participate in. These are some of the earliest instances that we find of cultural figures, whether they're writers or artists. Some of the earliest instances we find of individuals engaging in this kind of use of cultural celebrity to achieve an end that we would now recognize as ecological in its character. So thinking about some of the modern works that you've encountered on this model, how does this early example compare? In what ways is it similar? In what ways is it different? These are some larger questions that you might choose to reflect on generally, but I'd be curious if anyone has an initial observation now. Thinking about these works as situated in the mid to late 19th century, are the kinds of claims that they make in terms of the ecological significance of the railway similar to or different from the kinds of claims that you've seen other authors making in different contexts?
¿Ha topado alguna semejanza con os autores que estivemos a revisar durante o seminario en función do que están a facer Wordsworth e Ruskin en la presentación de Donaldson?
Pero del ferrocarril.
No,
Con intereses
con intereses ecológicos. I think that maybe part of the problem is that we usually think of activism as a very contemporary phenomenon, and I think that your presentation, besides being brilliant in itself, I think it's very useful for the seminar purposes, in the sense that has brought many threads together, which we have been discussing, like, for example, the role of art and painting and the rhetorical strategies related to the picturesque, the sublime, and the role of painters and writers in building a landscape out of a specific region. But on top of that, what you are presenting stresses that activism is there from the very beginning of the, let's say, environmental movement in the States, or in British Romanticism and the attitude of these writers and painters. And I think this is something we haven't seen that much. Actually, today, in relation to mega dams, we are going to see the role of both international writers like Arundhati Roy in relation to India, and also Galician writers in relation to dam constructions in Galicia. But I think that it's a very important issue, the one you've presented, because we haven't discussed this activist role in before the 20th century.
Well, I think we might be shifting gears here in a moment. So I might turn over to a different topic. Professor Dominguez has mentioned that the topic we'll be discussing for this week also includes megadams. So a very different context, but also a very different sort of topic. The one thing I will say, maybe before concluding, is that if you're interested in the 19th century roots of eco-critical thinking, then there are at least one or two keywords that draw particular attention to figures like Ruskin and figures like Wordsworth as some of the earliest examples of writers who are engaged in this kind of work. The topic of activism isn't one that I address explicitly, but it is a relevant one in this context. The first book is by an English scholar named Jonathan Bate, which is called, well, there's two works. One is called Song of the Earth. The other is called Romantic Ecology. But there are Jonathan Bate, a prestigious scholar of British Romanticism at the University of Oxford. And these are books that are, I think, in the Anglophone critical world recognized as foundational for the development of eco-critical theory, and interestingly take root in the writings of Wordsworth. And Bates spent some time contextualizing Wordsworth's letters about the railway as a crucial step in thinking about Wordsworth's contribution to modern environmentalist thinking. The other book is slightly more recent, by Vicky Alberton, and her partner Frederick Alberton Johnson. Is called Green Victorians. It's a book that is more specifically interested in Ruskin, but builds on some of the foundation of ideas put forward by Bate in applying them to Ruskin and other individuals who followed Ruskin in the mid-19th century in foregrounding ideas that we now characterize as environmentalists. So that's the book called Green Victorians by Alberton and Alberton Johnson, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2016, so just a few months ago. Beyond that, there's a very interesting book by Harriet Litvo, a scholar at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which you might have encountered, called The Dawn of Green. This is Litvo. The Dawn of Green, which is equally interested in Wordsworth and Ruskin. It's more of a historical study of the construction of a dam at a place called Thirlmere in the very center of the Lake District. And thinking about how Wordsworth and Ruskin's writing about the railway was actually also participated in the emergence of a new kind of consciousness about the environment. It was not only significant in relation to the development of railways, but also the development of new forms of water management. Thirlmere is a very interesting example, and one that is possibly relevant to the context we'll be moving on to talk about in a few minutes in relation to megadams, because it was a natural lake that was reservoired in order to provide additional water to the city of Manchester. And that's in the late 1860s into the 1870s. So roughly the same time that Ruskin is writing in Grotesque of the Railway, there's a different industrial company from Manchester who are responsible for petitioning for the damming and reservoiring of one of these lakes in order to provide water for a growing city centre. So there's a rich 19th century context to take into consideration when thinking about ecological thought, and in relevance to the study of literature, eco-critical theory. And I'll conclude there, because I've sort of switched gears to think more about megadams and let Professor Dominguez take over. But thank you all very much for your attention. It's been very nice presenting for you today.